Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another one of my retro Final Fantasy XIV videos. A Realm Reborn turns 10 this year, and so I've been looking back at old jobs, old raids, and even old patches, which is what we're doing in this video. For this one, we're going to be taking a look at patch 2.3, the halfway mark through that miraculous re-release of A Realm Reborn, and a lot different than our usual halfway marks that we've seen up to and through everything except for Endwalker. But 2.3 is kind of a packed one, so I think we should just get right to it. Alright, patch 2.3, Defenders of Eorzea. So I wrote out a list for this one ahead just to make sure I got all the important stuff. And patch 2.3 was kind of a loaded patch. There's a lot of brand new ideas, features, and quality of life here that are defining to things that I still engage with today, or were precursors to content that we have today. Of course, we have the main scenario quests. Again, I don't know why I even bother saying it every video, because of course it has main scenario quests. Literally every patch has main scenario quests, every major patch. In terms of side quests though, it of course had the continuation of Hildebrand. No trial like in patch 2.2, but it was still an okay Hildebrand patch overall. Oh, and it also had the Delivery Moogle side quests. Those are ones that were actually kind of interesting. They're still in the game and they offer a lot of insight into some of the side characters. So I would definitely recommend going out of your way to do those if you haven't done them yet, especially if you've enjoyed other things like Tataru's Grand Endeavor or any of the other various side quests that we've gotten in the recent Endwalker patches. Then we get into dungeons, and once again we had 3 dungeons back in all of our Realm Reborn patches. We had Tamtara hard mode, and that one's actually one of the most interesting hard mode dungeons we've ever had. You see, Tamtara actually has this kind of little side dialogue and quest that's going on alongside the main scenario, and it is something that you engage with as part of the main scenario, but there's a character who loses her loved one, her party disbands, and they're supposed to just be an amateur party, and they ended up fleshing out her story a lot here in Tamtara hard mode, as well as in the eventual Palace of the Dead. So that one holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts. We also had Stone Vigil hard mode, which a little bit less liked, but it does have some stuff that will be relevant in later patches, specifically mechanics for the final boss and for other bosses as a whole. And then you have Hullbreaker Isle. I don't really remember how people felt about that one. It's a pretty unique dungeon in that there's a lot of environmental traps and ways to abuse the enemies that are attacking you. There's traps that if you step on them, they're really bad for you. However, you can also lure enemies over them, and then it can trap them and they can take bonus damage. On top of that, it has some pretty gimmicky bosses, especially the final boss, which is, again, a love it or hate it kind of situation, but it was definitely representative of the more experimental kind of dungeons we used to have, and less of the straightforward stuff we have now. Now, speaking of dungeons, there's a major feature that they added in patch 2.3. The item level sync feature. Yeah, we didn't really have enough item level to warrant a sync feature yet, so they incorporated it here in patch 2.3. However, it actually wasn't used in any of those dungeons. It was used in PvP, specifically I think in Frontlines and the Fold, in order to item level sync people so that everyone was on equal footing regardless of the gear that they had. And then on top of that, they also added our first large-scale PvP map. At this point, we only had the Fold, which was basically deathmatch 4v4, but they added the secure mode for Frontlines in patch 2.3, and that was a pretty major thing. Initially, it was fairly well received, but Final Fantasy XIV PvP has always been fighting an uphill battle, and the actual game systems in PvP that were incorporated in patch 2.2 weren't entirely sitting well with everyone. So Frontlines had a surge of popularity that then waned, and that's kind of been the pattern for Final Fantasy XIV PvP ever since. Doing a lot better in Endwalker overall though. Oh man, you know what's a feature that was added in patch 2.3? The Hunt. This is a feature that I spend countless hours on. The very little amount of time I play during the off season of Final Fantasy XIV, the Hunt is almost always something I'm doing. It's basically a bunch of monsters out in the overworld, bosses out in the overworld, that grant rewards that to this day are still incredibly valuable. Back then it was a little bit worse of an era. So we currently have B ranks, A ranks, and S ranks, and even double S ranks or S plus, depending depending on, you know, how people want to classify them. But the B ranks right now, whenever they're killed, they respawn 5 seconds later. And those are used for weekly marks so people can just get some easy access to hunt currency. However, when it was first released in 2.3, it was like a 2-hour respawn. So if you weren't there to find it and attack it and get enough credit for it for your weekly, it would take another 2 hours before you'd have another chance. And the biggest meme was Null, because everyone had the same B rank hunt in the first week, and Null was it. So everyone would go around Corthus just like Null, 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 Null. And it was just an awful, awful experience. I don't remember when they fixed that. I feel like they fixed the respawn times for that within probably about a month or two. But it was a really, really rough start. Not to mention figuring out all the conditions for the S ranks, which are hilarious conditions. I've got a whole video on that if you want to check that out. Now, for other content, we had Circus Tower, the 24-man raid, the second one. That's part of the Crystal Tower raid series. Of course, way more important nowadays. But that was actually a really, really good 24-man when it released. There's a lot of mechanics we don't see nowadays in Circus Tower, especially with the second boss, that made it a decent bit challenging back then. Let's just say my Alliance raid guides were much more useful back in the day than they are now, given how the raid bosses are designed now. We also had Ramuh and Ramuh Extreme, which was another really interesting one. See, Ramuh had a tank mechanic, or has a tank mechanic, where you basically have to get stacks of lightning from these orbs that spawn all around the arena, and your tanks need to take turns collecting those, and if there's too many on the field, then Ramuh's attacks hit harder. But people struggled with that a lot. In fact, they probably still would if you were to do it synced. So what ended up happening is summoners could actually tank Ramuh with their Titan Eggy and completely ignore all of those mechanics. So you'd see summoners stacking a bunch of Vitality Materia melds and just getting as much health as they could, and then just using Sustain in order to keep the little nugget up. And then on top of that, you would have, you know, the actual healers providing a shield to him occasionally and stuff like that. But it was like, you know, 0 tanks. It was 0 tanks and like 2 healers, so you would just destroy the boss with all the extra DPS that you would have. And yeah, Square Enix didn't like that. They fixed that pretty quickly, but it's a fun little era to remember. And then we had the one that started it all when it comes to difficult raids. Now, let me be clear. The coils were designed to be what would be our modern day equivalent of Savage, but we didn't have a Savage difficulty or a story difficulty even back then. It was one difficulty, the endgame raid, and if you wanted to do the story for coil, you had to go through that. However, in patch 2.3, we got our first experimental raid, in that of second coil Savage. Now, it's the only one of the initial coils that had any sort of Savage difficulty. First and final both didn't have it, and the rewards were the same, except that you would get an achievement and a title upon clearing it for each individual fight. As for the actual fight design, they largely just fixed up exploits that people had found with the original encounters for second coil, and then multiplied a lot of mechanics so they appeared 2 to 4 times more frequently. They did add new mechanics as well to some of them, but that's the general gist. It was also scaled to be done in the best possible item level that you had available at the time. While it's labeled Savage, it's much closer to something like Ultimate, and as such, it's actually very challenging even to this day. If you go back and do it synced, maybe even cut your gear back a little bit, so it's a little more difficult. Even synced gear is, I'd say, way too strong for second coil Savage right now. It can be a very, very enlightening time when it comes to how the game worked back then and what kind of bosses we were up against at the time. Now, the rest of the features or additions were either quality of life or things that they were absolutely important features, but would I say they were as influential as some of the other things like the hunt or front lines or even Savage? No, but still very important. Like, we had the introduction of the first time tombstone bonus that was apparently added in patch 2.3. And also, interestingly, apparently before patch 2.3, if you made a tombstone purchase at the NPC, it just gave you the item without a confirmation window. So if you bought the wrong thing, it didn't pop up and say, "Are you sure you wish to buy this for this amount of tombstones?" It just ended up in your inventory. So it sounds like it was super easy to grief yourself back then. We also had augmented artifact armor. Essentially, it was just your artifact armor, but you could do a side quest to make it dyeable. And yeah, they've had all sorts of weird solutions to dyeable artifact armor over every expansion, and that is definitely one of the weirder ones. We had Chocobo Raising / the Chocobo Stable, and even the ability to reset the skill tree on your Chocobo. I remember us expecting that was going to be something really interesting, but what it boiled down to is you stable your Chocobo, you feed it, and it gets some experience points. Whoop-de-doo. Now, fortunately, with gardening and the Thenarian Onion, which I don't remember which patch that was actually added in, I didn't see it in these notes, so it might be something later, that would become more influential, being able to get over rank 10 for your Chocobo. But for here, it was, nice if you just didn't want to actually go out and grind your Chocobo levels, but it's not like the Chocobo mattered that much. I guess Spirit Bond people used it. That's a whole thing. But yeah, that was another feature that was added. We also have Desynthesis. Now, Desynthesis right now is a super accessible and easy thing, but for most of its lifespan, including when it was introduced in 2.3, it was kind of a headache to use Desynthesis. You could only get a certain amount of total levels between every craft, which meant that you had to basically pick 3 of them you wanted to max out, and then you could kind of work a little bit on another one. You also could only desynth items within a certain range of your Desynthesis skill, but what the exchange for that was, while it was harder to get into, it was harder to level, it also meant there was more money in it. In fact, one of the relic steps in patch 2.3, which, yes, patch 2.3 did have the next steps of the relic questline in, I believe, both 2.3 and 2.35, you actually needed to desynth items from an NPC in order to get the item that you needed, which meant that people who went out of their way to level Desynthesis, not that you needed much level to desynth these items, you needed almost none, actually made a decent amount of money from that. So that was the big thing. You just make so much more money off Desynthesis until they made that change, just not too many years ago. What else do we have here? We have housing stuff. They added another ward to the existing housing areas. Oh, and also private chambers. Yeah, the ability to rent your own room within the free company house. That was added in patch 2.3 as well. That's pretty nice. Oh, one thing I actually missed in the 2.2 video, in 2.28, they added the sightseeing log, which right now most people would just associate it with getting a little bit of extra EXP. The lore entry is nice, and there's some minions tied behind it. But back then, it was a whole ordeal. They've nerfed a lot of the older Realm Reborn ones since, and obviously we have flying now, so that, of course, makes it easier to some capacity. But oh boy, that was a time. And in 2.3, I believe they started making significant nerfs to the really annoying ones for sightseeing logs, but it was not great. And then we have a bunch of other little things here. The toy chest in your in-room, the ability to summon the esthetician at the crystal bell in your in-room was here. Apparently, the gear preview window didn't show actual weapon effects up until this patch. That's an interesting one. Oh my goodness. The ability to interact with NPCs while on a mount was added in 2.3. Before then, you had to get off a mount anytime you wanted to talk to an NPC. Now it gets us off the mount automatically, but you couldn't even do that back then. You had to manually get off the mount every time. And on top of that, mount actions were added. You know how like you can sometimes like shoot fireworks or a laser beam or whatever out of your mount? Yeah, we couldn't do that till 2.3. I think they just added it for the Magitech mount, the one that you get at the end of the A Realm Reborn story, but obviously we have tons of mount actions nowadays, so things have come a long way since. There's also the side quest series, The Greatest Story Never Told. Now, this was a set of side quests that didn't have quest objectives. You would be given information about how to solve the riddle within the quest itself, and then it was on you to figure out where to go. Nowadays, you could just Google all the results, but obviously when it first came out and people were trying to do it without being told what to do, it was a lot more exciting. And you could still do that now as long as you just don't Google where all of those things are. So that's a nifty little thing that was added in 2.3. We also had unhidden treasure maps. Now, bear in mind, we didn't have treasure dungeons yet in A Realm Reborn, but unhidden treasure maps were basically bonus treasure maps that you could find in the loot for the regular treasure maps, which were added, I believe, in patch 2.1. We covered that in the first video. So it was just an extra layer of loot and money to be made, which was great. A lot of people really liked that system, and then it returned in some capacity in Stormblood in an enhanced form. And I'm not going to lie, I've kind of been waiting for something similar to happen again, because while I think the layered RNG can be quite frustrating, given that I can't even get through the regular RNG sometimes, it's just that nice little bit to keep the party going, to keep the activity really engaged, given that you're limited to how many treasure maps you can gather in a set period of time. And then if you really want to keep going, you either need to have stored them away for a while or buy more maps. So I just liked this as a system to get more out of whatever party you had formed. Oh, and the last thing on my list, I'm sure this isn't everything, but the ability to toggle HP % display on monsters. We could not do that till 2.3. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, Happy, but if raid bosses had percentage-based transitions, how did you know? Well, you didn't. People did, of course, use a certain advanced tracker that you may be familiar with to get that kind of information prior to this. But if you were a vanilla player, then you just didn't find that out. You had to eyeball it. And that wasn't great. Let me tell you, it wasn't great. Either way, as you can see, 2.3 has so many things that we just kind of take for granted nowadays, or we don't see as much nowadays, especially like those unhidden treasure maps. It's a lot more influential of a patch than I had remembered it being, but I mean, you can't deny things like the Hunt, our first large-scale PvP, Savage, Desynthesis. Like, there's so many things here that are genuinely impressive, and this is why I'm doing this series, to remind myself and everyone watching, you know, that we didn't always have a lot of the things that we have. So when we do get stuff that we're excited to have, or expansions on these systems or updates to them, just know that they had to start somewhere. And apparently for a lot of them, it was 2.3. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap at our retro look back at patch 2.3. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. Go discuss these types of things in your Discords, and make sure you share the video as well, because, well, it supports the channel, and I enjoy doing this, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to know more about the history of Final Fantasy XIV. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one, and until then, take care.